Thanks very much for the invite from the Statsbomb team. I am going to talk about pressure and have a little bit more of a look into that. I will crack on. So what is pressure? So pressure is standing up in front of an audience and giving a talk. Ted's already talked a little bit about it. You saw the video, which you will see again. So pressure in the data set is an event that is triggered when a player enters within a 5-yard radius to the player in possession. If the player receives the ball and there already is a player in that radius, then the pressure event is also logged. And Ted talked about how that changes as you go up the pitch. So goalkeepers coming under pressure has a slightly larger radius. So in terms of the data, the actual field position where the pressure event is logged, so you get that in the data, and also in the more recent versions of the data set, pressure duration is collected. So I'll let this play through. So you've seen it already. So you'll have seen that as Sterling starts outside of the pressure radius and moves into it, that's when the pressure event is logged. And in this example, the two players are already within that radius, so it's logged immediately, and you get 2 different pressure events logged. And then this is showing in terms of the goalkeepers. I'll let that run through again. It's quite intuitive, so hopefully you'll get a good handle on it. But yeah. So yeah, again, you see the 2 players are already in the frame around the player, so they get logged together at the same time. And yeah, so that's the goalkeeper side. So just in terms of the data set, there's 160 matches from the season in the Premier League. There's different data coverage over different teams. So Liverpool and Manchester United have the most, Burnley then, and Everton. And then some of the teams have only 11 or 12 matches. So possibly a little bit more wary of some of the numbers around them, but I'll point them out when necessary. So where does pressure actually happen? So if we just take the pressure events, we plot them on the pitch, what do we see? So the bottom here is just a heat map, which you're probably familiar with. So just each block, the intensity of the colour is just the number of events in that zone of the pitch. The top plot just gives us a cross-section from one end of the pitch to the other. So very high up the pitch, so attacking from left to right, from the point of view of the team out of possession. So this would be, the goalkeeper would have it here, the attackers would be here. So there's less pressure exerted higher up the pitch, and that increases as you get into the midfield, and then decreases again as you get into a team's own defensive zone. And that tends to be where things like clearances and block shots from a defensive point of view really pick up. Instead of, you're not just trying to put pressure on the team, you're actually trying to physically take the ball off them or block their attempts at a shot or a pass. Just as a sort of gross kind of top-down level, you might sort of think that pressure would be related to possession. The more time you spend without the ball, the more pressure events you'll log, and vice versa. But at a match level and a season level, you don't actually see that. So on the left-hand side here is pressure events per match. So we've got quite a large range from around 100 to 400 pressure events per match. Possession along the x-axis here. There's basically very little correlation between the two. It's actually, it's slightly negative, but it's basically just a big blob of points. At a season, it doesn't really show anything different really. Again, very little correlation. So just in terms of actual pressure on its own, it doesn't seem to be massively related to possession. So we can tot up the events over a match and the matches in the season that are collected so far, and look at who applies the most pressure. So a team in a match, there's about, on average, 150 pressure events per match. But there's a decent range in terms of the number of actions that teams will make. So Southampton lead with about 180 per match, going down to Stoke, which is close to 140 per match. So there's quite a wide range. So Southampton at the top, Chelsea, Burnley. We sort of see the pressing teams around the kind of average, like Liverpool around here. You've got Manchester City and Spurs kind of below average. So that possibly tells us something about pressure. We're going to look more in terms of pressing as it in some following slides. But let's have a little bit of a look at how the pressure looks from a team level and from a pitch level. So along the bottom here is another heat map, but instead I'm showing the proportion of events, of pressure events that a team applies compared to the league average. So if the colour is red, they're putting more pressure on in that location of the pitch. If it's blue, they're putting less pressure on. This is going to be the same on all of the next few slides. So hopefully you can get orientated. On the top, the blue line is the league average in those zones, in that cross section, and in this case it's Burnley in red. So you can see that higher up the pitch, they're fairly close to league average. They're a little higher just throughout the pitch, and really they exert a lot more pressure in their own sort of defensive zone, and that probably matches somewhat with some of the things that we've heard about Burnley in terms of putting a lot of men between a shooter and the goal and trying to exert pressure that way and make shots harder to score. So that kind of lines up a little with our expectation. This is some nice, so this sort of colour contrast kind of, it can tell you the sort of how a team is sort of tilting the field in terms of pressure. You can kind of think of it like that. So with Chelsea, they don't put as much pressure on in the attacking half when they're without the ball, but they do put more pressure on in their own half, particularly in the kind of sort of defensive midfield kind of zone. West Brom, that tilt is greater, but also their intensity is lower. So again, quite similar sort of the Chelsea realm, but with fewer actions compared to the average. Manchester United are basically average. They have a very similar profile to the league average. And then Liverpool, this is where you start seeing the tilt the other way. So in their attacking half, as you might expect, obviously known as a pressing team, they're putting more pressure on comparatively in the attacking half and less in the defensive half. And we really see this contrast when we look at Manchester City. Obviously, Pep's well known in terms of his pressing philosophy, and you really see that strong gradient, that tilt of the field in terms of pressure with Manchester City's data. So if we look at in terms of just players and positions on the pitch, so in terms of positions, I've just sort of filtered the data for different positions. So midfielders and wingers tend to put on the most pressure, then forwards, and then that drops off as you get to more defensive positions. So full-backs are kind of in between, centre-backs the least, and perhaps unsurprisingly, goalkeepers aren't charging around, trying to put people under pressure too much. So I think this makes sense. Centre-backs are going to be less conservative. There's obviously there's probably not going to be cover behind them, so if they start charging around, they're possibly going to be bypassed. If we look at just individual players, these are the leaders in terms of pressure actions per 90 minutes played. So we see quite a few Burnley players, Liverpool players, Chelsea players, so some of the teams that were quite high up the list. We also see sort of lone wolves, I guess, in terms of, so you've got like people like Pascal Gross. There's not many other sort of Brighton players high up the list. Idrissa Gueye, again, Everton are very much kind of league average in terms of pressure actions. So you've got these kind of lone wolves sort of running around, putting a lot of pressure on. So maybe that's something interesting you might sort of key in on if you were sort of looking at opposition planning. We can key in on just individual players. So this is Roberto Firmino, so he's high up the list. I think he's the highest forward. So he's putting a lot of his actions on in the centre of the pitch, as you might expect. He's putting pressure on the centre-backs and defensive midfielders and deeper midfielders. But then somebody like Kante, as you would expect, it's a lot more concentrated in the defensive half. If you remember, Chelsea were putting a lot of pressure on in this zone. A lot of that is to do with Kante. So we can measure outcomes in a few different ways in terms of applying pressure. So one of those is to look at, do you generate shots off the back following a pressure event? So if you look at a pressure event and look in the 10 seconds following that event, A, does the team win the ball back, and B, does it then generate a shot or a goal? So on the left is in terms of applying pressure, so teams who they apply pressure to the opposition, they win the ball, they take a shot, sometimes they'll score a goal. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the leaders in terms of shots are Spurs and Liverpool. We very much associate that with their styles of play. There's not too much difference then in terms of shots per game amongst the other teams. It's very much sort of Liverpool and Spurs out on their own. They're also leading in terms of goals. They take more shots, so that kind of follows. Obviously, overlying something like expected goals would be an interesting kind of thing to look at here. And then this is the sort of the opposite of that. So teams that come under pressure, are they losing the ball and then their opponent is taking a shot? So Bournemouth conceding about 2.7, 2.8 shots a game off the back of pressure events. And West Ham are conceding a reasonable amount of goals. There's not too many games for West Ham, so maybe that's just a slightly biased sample, but something to kind of look at with the data. So that's one way of measuring like an outcome in terms of pressure. There are a lot of other things in terms of what we can do with pressure, obviously. So one of those is looking at counter-pressing. So that's when you, I'm sure I don't need to explain it, but that's when you press the opposition immediately after losing possession. So the initial kind of aim is to prevent an opponent's counter-attack. You've lost the ball and you're sort of defensively destabilized potentially. So in order to prevent your opponent from taking advantage of that, you press the ball quite aggressively and try and slow that counter-attack down. Now, often or ideally, you'll be looking to also win possession back immediately. So that's another kind of outcome metric you can have a look at in a minute. And also some teams will try to take that a step further. They'll press aggressively, they'll win the ball, and then they'll look to transition into attack very quickly. So 5 or 6 seconds, it tends to be a kind of common kind of rule for from a tactical perspective. Here I've used 5 seconds. It's one number in some code. You could change it to whatever you fancied, really, whatever kind of works with your view or whatever your team does. And just for this, I only looked at established possessions, so those longer than a second. So anything where a possession is where the ball's just cleared immediately, or if a game of head tennis breaks out, I'm not looking at those possessions. There's got to be some sort of opportunity to actually press. So again, we've got a heat map in terms of looking at actions across the pitch. So the team out of possession is attacking from left to right. And then this looks at the proportion of possessions where there is pressure applied within 5 seconds. So this is the sort of proportion of counter-pressing possessions. And again, there's this cross-section at the top looking at the number of possessions that meet that criteria. So they're possessions that have a pressure event within 5 seconds. And again, that sort of steadily increases as we get into the midfield, reaches a peak in the defensive midfield zone, and then drops. So this is based on the start location of a possession. So not too many possessions start in this zone, and also that rather than necessarily applying pressure, you're going to be trying to run out and block the shot or clear it, or there'll be a shot very quickly. So it drops off as you get close to goal there. We can look at this from a team perspective. So just for the sort of stats, the counter-pressing numbers I'm going to do here, I'm just going to look at possessions that start greater than this line, because that tends, from a pressing perspective, we're more looking at higher areas of the pitch. It's kind of a different thing when you get into deeper zones. That's just kind of good defending, really, rather than a choice so much. So if we look at, I define this as counter-pressing fraction. So about 40% of these established possessions across the league have pressure applied to them in the first 5 seconds. And then the red and blue bars give the deviation above and below this. So perhaps unsurprisingly, Manchester City sit quite far out the top up here. We then see Spurs and Liverpool. Again, that would kind of work with what we expect. If we go down the bottom, we've got quite a few of the kind of sort of typical British sort of, sit off and 2 banks of 4, all that kind of cliched stuff down at the bottom. Again, that kind of fits with our intuition. I think the interesting one here is Burnley in 4th. So Burnley are generally lumped in with that kind of cliched British kind of tactical regime, but actually they're sitting 4th in terms of counter-pressing. So what's kind of going on here. I think this is one of the nice things with this data. You can look at process and outcome separately. I think this is what this is kind of picking up with Burnley. This plot on the right here, it gives counter-pressing possession regains per match. So that's you counter-press within 5 seconds and you win the ball. So that's a sort of successful counter-press in terms of winning the ball. And that's compared to counter-pressing possessions per match. So that's the number of possessions where you put pressure on within 5 seconds, but you don't necessarily win the ball. And we see that Burnley lead the league in terms of that, in terms of the actual intensity, the number of those possessions per match. But they win the ball league average amount, basically. But then somebody like Tottenham have a similar number of counter-pressing possessions per match, but they lead the league by some margin in terms of actually regaining possession. And that kind of fits in with what we think we know about Spurs. So I think what's happening here is Burnley are counter-pressing in order to just kind of slow down the opposition, but they're not necessarily trying to win the ball back. It's more of a defensive measure to slow down the attack, get themselves back into a good defensive shape, and go from there. And so whilst in total pressure events didn't relate to possession, but when we look at counter-pressing, it very strongly does. So on the left here is the counter-pressing fraction that you've just seen on the previous slide. And on the left, we're looking at minutes out of possession for a team. So the amount of time that their opponent has the ball. There's a quite strong negative correlation there. So the more your opponent has the ball, the less you counter-press as a general rule. And the less your opponent has the ball, the more you counter-press. And we see a very similar relationship when we look at just sort of the possession just based on pass volumes. So there's probably some circular sort of causation here. So Manchester City, their opponents don't have the ball a lot, so they're able to they're able to be more intense in terms of the amount of counter-pressing they can do. But the more you counter-press, the more you win the ball back on average, so you get more possession. And there's a kind of sort of circular kind of logic there. But I think that makes more sense in terms of our intuition. So total number of pressure events doesn't sort of match up, but the sort of pressing, the more intense kind of style of that pressure does. So if we look at these these maps again, so you've already seen this just to keep you grounded in terms of what the league looks like. So this is similar to the previous lot of slides. This is looking at the proportion of the possessions above or below average that are counter-pressing possessions for a team. This is Manchester City. So I mentioned that Manchester City aren't really, in terms of the number of possessions that they're counter-pressing possessions per match, it's not that intense, but they're not spending that much time without the ball, and that relates to pressing. But they are doing it a lot more on possessions across the pitch, particularly in the attacking half when they don't have the ball and their opponent starts those possessions in those zones. We see a similar thing with Spurs. Again, sort of what we'd expect from a counter-pressing team. And Liverpool, again, the intensity isn't that different to league average, but they are proportionally, they're doing a lot more than the league average. I think this is interesting with Burnley. I think this gives you a bit of an insight to their process and what they're actually trying to do tactically. We see a very strong kind of tilt in terms of the counter-pressing from one half to the other. So it seems very much if their opponent starts their possession sequence in the attacking half, then they will counter-press. If they're starting those possessions close to the goal, they don't press as much. They're probably more collapsing back in towards their own goal, getting men behind the ball. And I think that gives you a bit of an illustration of the sort of process that this can pick up. And then to kind of switch around to somebody who isn't counter-pressing very much, this is West Brom, this is an example. The intensity isn't there, they're counter-pressing a lot less than the league average, and they're just doing it less proportionally as well. But with a slight tilt towards the opposition half. And then Stoke, basically across the board, they just don't press intently, and that's why they're very much at the bottom of that figure on the left there. So again, similarly to before, going to look at just different positions and different players. So in terms of counter-pressing, it sort of switches around from more attacking players to more midfielders in terms of position. So defensive midfielders, attacking midfielders. That makes sense in terms of that's where midfield is where a lot of new possessions start. It's where a lot of the counter-pressing will be taking place. Again, there's a drop-off with full-backs and centre-backs. Again, that's to do with just centre-backs aren't going to be that high up the pitch a lot of the time. They're not going to be putting themselves under pressure, no pun intended, by charging out and pressing quite as much as their defensive midfielder would because they've got cover. Again, we can look at players. So Pascal Gross, again, is at the top. Stephen Dufour. We've got quite a few Burnley players, quite a few Burnley midfielders specifically, which matches up with what just been talking about. Again, you've got this kind of lone wolf phenomenon with like Idrissa Gueye. Morgan Schneiderlin is in there, so although he hasn't played quite as much, I think. But and then there's quite a few Liverpool players sort of creeping up, sort of Jordan Henderson down the bottom, and we're seeing other like David Silva was not on the pressure events list, but he's very high up in terms of counter-pressing. And again, you can look at this in terms of actual players. So at the top is Roberto Firmino again, because I'm a biased Liverpool fan. This is giving you an idea of where he's counter-pressing. The marker's aware of the actual pressure events are occurring, so he's dropping back and applying pressure to like the opposition midfielders and defenders a lot of the time. On the bottom is Moussa Dembele, so from obviously Spurs, another counter-pressing team. Most of his actions are in the defensive half, so possessions are starting in this kind of zone, and he's either dropping back and pressing quite quickly, or he's involved when the possessions are starting higher up the pitch. And we can try and look at outcomes in a slightly different manner. So we've looked at the sort of the intensity and the regains, but this is looking at, on the left is teams that are able to beat the counter-press, so they're able to play through those counter-pressing possessions and generate shots. So this is done as a proportion. So Liverpool are at the top there. So that's quite a robust number because there's a lot of games for Liverpool. Some of these at the top, there's not that many games. So like West Brom, I'd possibly put a bit of an asterisk next to. So you can see some sort of stylistic differences. Teams that are able to play through that press and are able to generate shots off the back of them. On the right is kind of, failed is probably a strong word, but it's kind of one way of looking at opponents that are able to play through the counter-press. So when a team counter-presses, what happens in those possessions? And so just here, it's just simply is a shot conceded. So at the top here is West Ham United, quite a way out in front. Again, bit of an asterisk on that one because I think there's only 11 games for West Ham in the data set. Burnley are third on this list, but I can tell you actually those counter-pressing possessions are generally quite slow with Burnley in terms of the speed that their opponents are attacking. So Burnley concede a lot of shots. So there are shots at the end of those possessions quite a lot of the time, or a decent fraction of the time, but they're generally in a slower kind of environment, and you can imagine that they're getting a better defensive shape. If we look down at the bottom, we've got, so in terms of the more intense counter-pressing teams, Liverpool and Spurs are quite successful in that kind of regard. They're not conceding many shots in those counter-pressing possessions. So we've just looked at a start of a possession as a pressing trigger, but we can look at some other ones. So pass direction is one that is often talked about, particularly backwards passes or sideways passes. So just to try and orientate you, the team without the ball is attacking down the pitch. So the team with the ball that they are pressing, in these examples that I'm going to show now, they are starting their passes in this zone of the pitch. So obviously this is Statsbomb, so I was contractually obliged to include some sort of radar plot.
This is a lie.
And hopefully it's fairly intuitive because it's like a radar in the movies, you know. It actually talks about direction. So, so it's orientated with the pitch. So forward passes up the pitch, passes to the right, left, backwards. So, and then the blue line is the league average, giving you the the proportion of passes passed in those directions that have pressure applied to them within 5 seconds of that pass being made. The first ring is 10%, the second ring is 20%, the third ring is 30%. And what we do see is that forward passes are pressed less aggressively, there's a lower fraction, whereas sideways and backwards passes are pressed more aggressively. We can look at that in terms of particular teams. West Brom press a lower proportion of passes by quite a large amount. There's some suggestion that they press a little bit more on backwards passes in this slice of the radar, but really it's, they're not pressing too intently. So there's not too much to kind of, aside from understanding that they're not going to press you too much, there's not a great kind of signal there. Chelsea are around about league average, but we see that they're more likely actually to press forward passes from this zone compared to the league average. Liverpool, so they press more aggressively than league average, and there does tend to be that bias towards the flanks and somewhat towards backward passes. So that again kind of fits in with what we know about Jurgen Klopp's system. Pass direction is something that we would expect to be a pressing trigger, and that's shown up nicely here with Liverpool. The next one is the sort of strongest example, I think, is Manchester City. Very much when players are in this zone and they pass to their flanks, so you could imagine as the opposition fullback, if the ball's coming your way, there's a good chance you're going to get pressed, basically. And that's something you could talk about in terms of your team planning, make your fullbacks aware of that, maybe try and change the position of other players, maybe change who you actually try to pass to at the start of those possessions. So that's quite a clear signal. We can move up the pitch and see if we see anything different. So we're more in the centre of the pitch here. The league average is shifted with the direction of the pitch. Passes forward now are more likely to be pressed, which you can kind of imagine if you're in the centre circle, you pass the ball forward, that's going to be in, say, an attacker or like a forward or an attacking midfielder. They're more likely to be coming under pressure in that instance. So we see a slightly different pattern to teams back to the example further back on the pitch. Again, West Brom, just for a below average example, they kind of fit the league average pattern, but are a much reduced rate. Chelsea, so they're above average in terms of the proportion of passes they're pressing, but it's very much dominated towards the forward passing. So if you pass forwards against Chelsea, expect there to be some pressure coming your way, probably in the form of N'Golo Kante, I imagine. Liverpool, again, we're seeing that sort of tendency towards the flanks and somewhat to backward passes. And again, that feature with Manchester City is quite strongly there. Again, passes to the flanks, they get pressed. So that's another kind of way you can look at pressing triggers with this data. And then the final kind of outcome of these pressure events is, do you actually regain possession? So again, I've used a 5-second cutoff here. Again, it's one number in some code. You can change it depending on what kind of tactics you might be employing. And then again, we've got this heat map. Team out of possession is attacking left to right. It's the proportion of those possession regains that are via pressure, and the number of events cross-section along the top. So again, we're seeing more possessions being broken up following pressure in the sort of midfield zone as you get closer to goal, and then that drops off once you get to goal. Again, that's where you're having more sort of clearances, blocks, kind of, or tackles being kind of the intervention in terms of defending. So again, I'm using this kind of line forward from the sort of midfield zone forwards to look at these pressing stats. So again, looking at these possession regains following pressure and possession. So it's similar to before. So this is possession regains per match following pressure. And on the bottom here is, again, minutes out of possession per match, so the amount of time that your opponent has the ball. And we see, again, another strong correlation between those two, and similarly with possession. This is where we start to see the real kind of separation between what we kind of know as the pressing teams in the Premier League, Manchester City, Spurs and Liverpool, from the pack. They're quite significantly above the average and their peers. So that's sort of reiterated here again. So Liverpool are at the top here. They weren't pressing as much as their counterparts. Their counter-pressing wasn't quite as significant as Manchester City, but they are good at pressing and winning the ball, which, again, is something we kind of anticipate. So we very much see those pressing teams as the leaders, and then that drops off. We've got, Stoke at the bottom again. Stoke are just quite passive, basically, in terms of their defending through all these metrics, and you've got, your Crystal Palace and your West Brom, they're quite low down the list again. This is looking at, on the right is Liverpool, looking at that kind of field tilt in terms of where they're getting these possession regains following pressure. So the red colours are where they're doing that above average, and the blue colours are where they're doing that below average. And we see, and on the top is that kind of intensity. So in terms of the intensity, they're winning the ball back quite a lot compared to the average, and that's very much tilted towards the attacking half of the field. Again, that matches up with what we'd expect. Spurs, very similar story. Slightly stronger contrast in terms of getting into deeper zones. Manchester City, again, another strong tilt, very much tilted into the attacking half. So they're putting a lot of pressure on in that half, and they're regaining the ball a lot. And then just to kind of look at teams where they're regaining the ball somewhat less intensely. So this is Burnley. So again, they are biased towards the attacking half. They are pressing in that half, and they are winning the ball, which kind of matches up with the counter-pressing numbers that we looked at earlier in terms of that split between both halves of the pitch. And West Brom are then the sort of opposite of the Liverpools and the Spurses and the Manchester City. We see that tilt is much more towards the defensive end. And again, Stoke are just kind of league average. There's not really a pattern here in terms of whether they're winning possession more in different areas of the field. It's just generally kind of quite below average in a lot of ways in terms of the intensity. And then, again, look at who regains the pressure in terms of players and positions. So now it's more the attacking players that are getting more of the pressure, the possession regains following pressure, and that drops off again to the defensive players. Again, that matches up with what we saw earlier. And then who's regaining pressure, possession most via pressure? Again, Lingard's going quite high on these lists, but now we see Oxlade-Chamberlain has really jumped up this list. He wasn't very high on the other lists, if at all, but he's really jumped up there. He's settled in well to the Klopp mantra. Firmino's up there at the top. Again, not unexpected. So again, showing my bias, I've got Firmino on there. This is where he's applying pressure, and his team is winning the ball back shortly afterwards. So that's a lot on the right centre-back and the goalkeeper a lot of the time. Oxlade-Chamberlain is very much, he's pulling out to the flanks, and that's where he's applying pressure. So again, there might be a sort of touchline kind of trigger there, and he's been quite successful in terms of his team wins the ball back shortly afterwards. And again, we can try and look at those sort of outcomes in a slightly different way. So this is shots attempted following a pressing regain. So that is in the 10 seconds after they've regained possession, are they generating a shot? Again, sort of similar to the story earlier, we see Spurs and Liverpool at the top there. That does kind of conform with what we'd expect. And then we've got other teams that aren't, they're both not regaining the ball that much, and they're also not turning those into shot attempts a lot. And then the other side of that is shots conceded following a loss of possession. So these teams have the ball, they lose the ball, and they concede a shot quite quickly afterwards. So West Ham are leading the league up here. Bournemouth are high up here again. We saw them high earlier. And then at the bottom here, you're seeing sort of like Liverpool are down here. Burnley again, if they do lose the ball in these sort of areas, they're not conceding that many shots. So that's pretty much all I've got to show you today. So just to kind of sum up, I think the kind of key thing in terms of trying to look at this pressure event data from a sort of pressing point of view is that you can really describe processes and outcomes separately. And I think that is an advantage over the sort of existing on-ball data. So the metrics that have been used for pressing. So things like passes per defensive action. People have looked at the amount of time that possession length and whether teams are breaking up possessions within a certain number of passes or a certain number of seconds. Those are very much biased towards outcomes, whereas this allows you to separate processes and outcome, which I think is quite a nice thing. We can, in this data set, just in a few weeks of playing with this, I've been able to work out some pressing triggers, such as a change of possession, pitch location, or pass direction. We can look at success in a lot of different ways. So regaining possession is one of them. Shots, you can layer in expected goals. Very much think this can feed into your opposition scouting, like, is your opponent going to press us? What are their triggers? Who's going to press you? And kind of fold that into your scouting phase. We can look at player tendencies and plan for them, perhaps. And also, again, this is something that you can layer into your recruitment. You're a high-pressing team. It's another thing you can look at in terms of, this player that I'm interested in. I've got two similar players, but this guy has shown that he's capable of pressing, so maybe he's the guy to go for. So just some sort of further thoughts and work to wrap up. So I didn't look at the pressure duration data here in detail, but from having a bit of a look at the data, it seems that pressing teams tend to have shorter pressure durations on average, which I don't know if that goes against expectation a little. So I think Spurs had the shortest duration on average. So maybe it's a case of the pressing teams are giving that kind of short, sharp kind of pressure, and they're catching teams out with those kind of short movements and through their kind of organisation and timing. You could draw other pressure triggers from the data. So does a team set pressing traps adjacent to the touchlines, or are they targeting certain profiles of players? Maybe you could look at your passing models and see do they actually target the poor passes on the team? Or you could look at the poor passes on the team. Tom's going to, I think, talk a little bit about this in terms of, how do players cope under pressure? Or do they key in on playmakers in the team and try and shut them down through pressure? And again, or you could look at positions, so goalkeeper, centre-backs. Do teams only really press those, or is it more in the midfield zones? There's a few questions in terms of variation. So how do these metrics vary across the season? So for instance, I know Manchester United came out as average in terms of pressure events per match, but they had I noticed they had quite a large range in their variability, quite a large range in the number of events they had per match, so maybe there's something tactical going on there. So things like that you'd really want to look at. How does it vary across a single match? Do teams come out and put a lot of pressure on at the start of halves? How does game state affect that? And then things like how does these compare across different leagues? I didn't really quite have a large enough data set really to look at efficiency, but certainly that was something looking at some of the Liverpool players. There were quite a few quite efficient pressers looking at those players, and that's something else you could layer into your analysis and your recruitment side of things. And an obvious thing from a recruitment point of view is how well do these sort of player level metrics transfer from team to team. And I think I've only really talked about pressing in a lot of ways here, but looking at centre-backs, when do they apply pressure? Are they quite aggressive centre-backs in terms of pressure? Is there a sort of headless chicken syndrome where they're running up the pitch, they're putting pressure, they're getting bypassed, they're conceding shots afterwards? That's something you can filter out of the data. And that gives you a sort of new level of analysis for centre-backs, which you wouldn't be able to pick up from on-ball kind of event data. So yeah, thanks very much for listening. And there's an example of Firmino not actually pressing someone. So thank you.